He was just a waiter in a small-town diner, quiet, scarred, and easily overlooked. Most customers barely looked at him. Some whispered, a few laughed, but when one teenager secretly snapped a photo of his burned face, it set off a chain of events no one could have imagined. Because hidden beneath the scars was a history of bravery, of fire, of lives saved under gunfire, and one silent witness that day recognized what the world had forgotten. A true hero, hiding in plain sight. This is the story of what happened when the past came calling and the town finally saw the man behind the wounds. The diner was quiet like it always was on weekend afternoons. Families talked in low voices, forks clinking gently against plates. At one table near the window, a group of teenagers sat with milkshakes and fries, their voices slightly louder than the rest. One of them, tall, baseball cap turned backward, nudged his friend and nodded toward the waiter. "Hey, check out his face," he whispered, suppressing a laugh. "Looks like something from a horror movie." The waiter was a tall man, early 40s maybe, moving with the kind of precision that comes from repetition and a desire not to be seen. The right side of his face looked almost normal, but the left, it was a network of scar tissue, smooth and shiny in some places, twisted and raw in others, a visible reminder of something awful. The teen lifted his phone and held it up like he was taking a selfie. But the camera was aimed just over his shoulder, snapping the image of the waiter's profile. The group snickered. The waiter didn't react. He set down the coffee pot, wiped the spill with practiced grace, and turned away, his shoulder slightly more rigid than before. At a nearby booth, a man in his 50s sat with his teenage son. He hadn't been paying attention to the teens until now. The man froze, eyes narrowing. As the waiter leaned forward to clean a table, his shirt sleeve shifted slightly, revealing part of a faded tattoo on his forearm. It was old, weathered, but unmistakable to anyone who'd ever worn the uniform. A combat medic's cross entwined with the insignia of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The man's fork hovered in midair. His heart thudded once, then again, harder. That tattoo didn't belong to just anyone. "Dad?" his son asked, noticing the change in his expression. "What's wrong?" But the man didn't answer. He was no longer looking at his son. He was staring at the scarred waiter and seeing, through the burns and silence, a ghost from a battlefield long past. Daniel Morgan had once been a name spoken with reverence in hushed voices across sand-swept tents and forward operating bases. A combat medic during the brutal Fallujah campaign, he had run into the fire, not away from it, the day he pulled 4 wounded Marines from a flaming Humvee. His uniform melting to his skin had been the day his life changed forever. Now, 5 years later, Daniel moved like a shadow through the Riverside Diner, a small roadside eatery nestled in a sleepy riverside town no one ever talked about. His days were simple, mechanical. He clocked in early, tied on a crisp apron, and worked long hours clearing tables, pouring coffee, and trying to avoid the gazes that followed him. Half of his face and neck bore the scars of that fire. Grafted skin, warped lines, the kind of injury that made children stare and parents quietly pulled them closer. He had learned to approach tables from the right, the side less marred. Speak in short sentences, avoid eye contact, and retreat as quickly as he came. It wasn't cowardice, it was survival. When he had first applied, the diner's manager, Mike, a practical man in his 50s, had hesitated. "You sure you want to be out front?" Mike had asked, glancing at the visible burn lines along Daniel's jaw. "We've got kitchen shifts." "I'm not hiding," Daniel replied evenly. "Not anymore." And Mike, sensing something deeper than pride, gave him the job. Still, every day came with its own quiet battles, a look that lingered too long, a whispered comment, the subtle shift of someone moving to another seat. None of it surprised Daniel. He had accepted the world's discomfort long ago. But what wore him down, what made his chest ache even more than the pain of old wounds, was the silence. The kind that told him his presence made others uneasy. The kind that made it easier for people to pretend he wasn't there at all. He had no close friends in town, no family nearby. He avoided veterans groups and reunions. There was no ceremony in what he'd survived. No glory in burned skin and broken sleep. He just wanted quiet, peace. And if that meant spending his life wiping counters and refilling coffee cups in a place where nobody knew what he'd done, then maybe that was enough. but even the quietest places can echo with ghosts. Carl Wilson hadn't planned to come to the diner that day. He and his younger son Alex had been running errands when hunger and convenience drew them in. Carl liked quiet places, places where conversation didn't need to compete with noise, where he could talk to his son about things that mattered. College plans, future goals, and how to grow into the kind of man who doesn't shrink from responsibility. He'd just begun explaining application deadlines when he noticed the waiter at the next table. Daniel. He hadn't heard the name in years, but he didn't need it. The face, what was left of it, carried enough memory. More than that, it was the tattoo on the man's forearm that struck like a bell. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The same unit Carl had served with. Different companies, but Fallujah had blurred company lines. Everyone knew the stories. Everyone knew the doc. The man who'd run into fire to drag wounded Marines to safety. The medic who, despite being on fire himself, had refused to stop until the last man was out. They said he didn't scream, didn't flinch, just moved faster than anyone else could, carrying bloodied soldiers like they weighed nothing. Carl remembered the name now, Daniel Morgan. He remembered the radio chatter, the chaos, the breathless voice calls out vitals. And he remembered one more thing. Daniel had saved Carl's eldest son, Lieutenant James Wilson, that day, pulled him from the vehicle, leg shattered, spine peppered with shrapnel. James had survived, still walked with a limp, but he was alive because of that medic. Now here was that same man, scarred, alone, setting water glass on laminate tables while teenagers laughed behind his back. Carl's chest tightened. He turned to his son just in time to see Alex lift his phone, smirking. "Alex," Carl said, voice low and cold, his hand shooting across the table to grip the boy's wrist. "Put it down." Alex blinked. "What?" "You just did the worst thing I've ever seen you do. It's just a picture, Dad, for laughs." "The man isn't what you'd think," Carl said, his eyes still on Daniel. "Not even close." Alex looked confused, but Carl's tone left no room for argument. The phone was handed over without another word. Carl deleted the photos and stood. "Stay here," he said, then walked straight to the manager's station. The balding man looked up from a stack of receipts. "Problem with your meal?" "No. I need to speak to your waiter, the one with the scars." The manager hesitated. "Daniel's on shift. He doesn't like to talk about the past." Carl nodded. "Just give him this." He scribbled on a napkin and handed it over. "Tell him it's from Lieutenant Wilson's father. He'll understand." That night, Carl sat at his desk and stared at a blank postbox in a private veterans forum. Then he began to type. "Today I watched a hero serve coffee in a small-town diner while kids laughed at his scars. That man, Daniel Morgan, is the reason my son is alive. He didn't ask for recognition. He never wanted glory. But we owe him more than silence." By morning, the post had gone viral. Monday mornings at the Riverside Diner were typically uneventful, slow, sleepy, and quiet enough to hear the hum of the refrigerators behind the counter. But this Monday began differently. Long before sunrise, something unseen had already begun to gather in the air, something weightier than routine. By 7:00 a.m., a dozen individuals, all in immaculate military dress, were seated throughout the diner. Marines in crisp blues, Army veterans with ribbons pinned to their chests, and Navy corpsmen with polished insignias waited quietly, taking their seats one by one. None were ordered immediately. None explained their presence. Each placed a small white card at the edge of their table beside their glass of water. The message was the same on every card, simple and powerful. "Thank you, Doc." The manager, Mike, who at once hesitated to place Daniel out front, now stood behind the counter in stunned silence. He hadn't known who his employee truly was. Not until the letters and calls started pouring in the day before. Not until the napkin from a man named Carl Wilson made its way to Daniel's locker and sparked something that couldn't be undone. By 8:00 a.m., the number of uniformed visitors had doubled. A quiet reverence settled over the space, replacing the usual idle chatter. Strangers nodded to one another with the kind of recognition that needed no words. People who had served, who understood sacrifice, who carried ghosts of their own. When Daniel arrived for his shift at 8:30, he paused just inside the entrance. The sight before him stole the air from his lungs. A sea of uniforms filled nearly every booth and table, each pair of eyes turning slowly to meet his. The instinct to retreat surged in him, an old, practiced reflex honed over years of wanting nothing more than to go unseen, but something, perhaps deeper than pride, held him there. Mike approached, eyes filled with a mixture of apology and awe. The quiet man he had once suggested a move to the back of the house was now the center of something sacred, something larger than a job or a scar. Daniel said nothing. He simply moved to the break room, tied on his apron, and stepped into his shift as he always had, though his hands trembled slightly now as he filled pitchers and wiped down menus. As he approached the first table, the Marine rose silently, squared his shoulders, and offered a precise, perfect salute. The sound of a chair scraping back echoed across the space, and then the silence deepened. One by one, the veterans stood, men and women alike, each offering their gesture of respect, not loud, not theatrical, but devastating in its sincerity. Some quietly stepped forward to shake his hand, others left small notes folded beneath saucers. One woman in a Navy uniform approached with a small wooden box. She explained its contents with reverent hands, a Purple Heart, once belonging to her father, a man Daniel had pulled from the fire who had passed the year before. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but her message rang louder than any ceremony could. Outside, news crews began to gather. Word had spread quickly. The internet had amplified what the veterans had quietly ignited. But inside, Daniel continued his shift. He refilled the coffee, cleared plates. His movements were calm and precise, yet there was something different in his posture now. Not pride exactly, not comfortable either, but a stillness, a kind of unspoken reconciliation with the identity he had buried so long ago. Later that morning, Carl Wilson arrived, flanked by both his sons. The elder, James, now walking with a deliberate limp, moved toward Daniel with determined steps. The moment they embraced was brief, almost fragile, but it stirred something collective in the room. A memory shared by many, yet lived fully only by a few. Daniel had not asked for recognition. He had only wanted to be left alone. But when a tide of gratitude rises strong enough, even the most hidden hearts can no longer remain untouched. In the days that followed, something subtle yet irreversible shifted within the walls of the Riverside Diner. The story had traveled beyond the town limits, carried by the digital winds of social media and veteran forums. But unlike the usual online noise, this wave brought with it something quieter and heavier: respect. Daniel kept working his regular shifts. He didn't speak about what had happened on that Monday. He made no mention of the uniforms, the salutes, or the letter that had arrived the next morning with the Pentagon's seal. The letter had been formal, an invitation to attend a ceremony recognizing battlefield medics, with a note that the Medal of Honor nomination, long buried in bureaucracy, had resurfaced. He folded the letter with careful hands and placed it in the back of his locker beneath a clean apron. When Mike asked if he planned to go, Daniel's answer was simple: no. There was no bitterness in his voice, only clarity. He didn't need a medal to make sense of the past. He didn't want to be a speech or a symbol or another photo on a slideshow at a military gala. What he wanted was what had always eluded him: a day without whispers, a job where people saw the man before they saw the scars. And slowly it began to happen. Customers who once asked for other servers now requested Daniel's section. Regulars left notes instead of tips, thank you cards from grandfathers who had served, from mothers whose sons wore uniforms, from strangers who had read his story and felt compelled to acknowledge something sacred. But perhaps the most unexpected change came not from veterans or journalists, but from the same group of teenagers who had once mocked him. They returned, quiet and uneasy at first, not to stare, but to help. One Tuesday morning, Daniel found a folded card on his usual break room chair. The handwriting was unfamiliar at first, but after a moment he recognized it. It belonged to Alex Wilson. Your scars are medals we cannot wear for you. There was no signature. None was needed. Later that week, Daniel noticed something curious through the kitchen service window. The teenagers were back, but instead of phones, they had notebooks open. Seated in the corner booth was an off-duty paramedic demonstrating basic first aid techniques, tourniquets, pressure points. The same tools Daniel had used under fire are now being passed to the next generation. Mike had offered the space, quietly and without fanfare. When Daniel asked why, Mike only shrugged. Seemed like the least we could do. Daniel watched the teens practice, their faces serious and focused. It stirred something long dormant in him, a flicker of purpose that went beyond duty or discipline. Perhaps there was value in being visible after all. Perhaps in letting his scars be seen, he had created a space where others could learn not just how to save lives, but how to live them with empathy. There were still hard days. Some stares would never go away, but the silence around his presence had changed. No longer filled with discomfort, it now held something closer to reverence. And that, more than any metal, felt like healing. The diner opened as usual on a quiet Thursday morning, sunlight slanting in through the front windows, glinting off the coffee pots and chrome napkin holders. Daniel moved through the familiar rhythms, wiping down menus, setting out silverware, brewing the first pot of the day. Outside, the line stretched farther than usual. Veterans in worn leather jackets, families with small children, and even strangers from out of town had come, not for spectacle, not for headlines, but to simply sit, eat, and if the moment felt right, shake the hand of a man they'd never met, but somehow knew. Daniel accepted it all with the same calm grace he carried into every room. He didn't smile more, he didn't talk louder, he just was, present, steady, and that presence had begun to ripple in ways he hadn't expected. Carl Wilson continued to stop by, always with quiet gratitude in his eyes. James, his elder son, the one Daniel had saved, had become a regular as well, walking with a limp that no longer seemed to define him. They never spoke at length. They didn't need to. Some debts, both men understood, didn't require repayment, only respect. Alex, once awkward and ashamed, had taken on a quieter transformation. He began volunteering for veterans groups, helped organize fundraisers. The shame of a single careless moment had become the spark of something redemptive. He was learning that growth often began at the point of recognition, of seeing someone else fully, perhaps for the first time. On one of those mornings, after the rush had died down, Daniel found another card tucked beneath the register. This one was hand-printed, simple, and unsigned. Honor doesn't reside in medals or uniforms. It lives in those who carry wounds yet harbor no hatred. Daniel read the words twice before slipping the card into his pocket. He didn't know who had written it. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the person who wrote it simply saw what so many others had missed for so long. That true strength rarely announces itself. It endures, silently. In the man who serves tables with quiet dignity. In the one who walks into the fire because someone else needed help. The Purple Heart still sat in its box in the break room, untouched. The invitation to Washington remained folded in the back of his locker, and yet every plate Daniel carried, every glass he filled, every young face that looked at him not with fear but with respect, that was the recognition that mattered. Outside, beyond the hume of the diner, the world moved on, but inside, something sacred had taken root. The wounds hadn't vanished, the past couldn't be undone, but in the stillness of an ordinary place, something extraordinary had quietly taken its place. A quiet man, once misjudged, now stood at the center of something larger than valor or memory. He didn't ask to be seen, but finally, he was. And not for his scars, but for the man he had always been beneath them.